Where were you in 62? Well, I wasn't alive, but that's the tagline for George Lucas's 1973 gem, American Graffiti. This is the first film I'm going to bring up on my favorite movie list. It's going to be number 20, and it's my 20th favorite film of all time. I've never actually ranked it as one of my favorite movies. I've always said it's one of my favorite films, but I would never know where to put it if someone asked me. But I'll say now that I have to do a list, I have to give an arbitrary number to it. It's my 20th favorite film. So why is that? That's an interesting question because to a lot of people, George Lucas, their favorite George Lucas movie, I'd say to most people, Star Wars, New Hope. And when I was a kid and a teenager, it was my favorite George Lucas movie too. I always liked this movie. I saw this movie when I was really young. But I love Star Wars. I always love Star Wars. I still like Star Wars. However, the older I get, I rewatch New Hope now, and I'm not saying it's age because obviously people that are older like Star Wars. I see flaws in the acting. I think Mark Hamill's not so great in the first movie. He gets better in Empire and Returns. I think those scenes on Tatooine with Uncle Owen, and stuff. The like you say that every year. Those scenes are kind of, they just don't hold up that well for me, just for me. And I feel like there's things in New Hope, but there's such an energy and excitement and joy and wonder to that movie that overcomes those things, obviously. But for me, the best George Lucas film, and the only one I think that he completely nailed, 100%, like just perfect, is American Graffiti. See, I think Lucas's biggest flaws always lied in the human element with his films, excluding Star Wars and American Graffiti. He's a master technical director, just a proficient technician, right? And he was part of a group of filmmakers in the 70s, like Francis Ford Coppola or Martin Scorsese, that were trying to do something new with Hollywood, with mainstream cinema, and were bringing over these foreign influences. And they wanted to go back to something they wanted to go back to the Hollywood that they loved as kids. And Francis Ford Coppola actually he almost released this movie and he regrets he didn't because he would have made upwards of like $30 million. George Lucas came off making THX 13 I think it was 1138, and it was something a lot of people noticed for its set design and visuals, and he was very acclaimed for his work in film school. And when he made this film, he made it on a budget of under $1 million. It's like 777,000, and he came in under budget. He came in under time. He did a really good job with this, and it showed his ability to handle productions very well. Which George Lucas has always had that skill, and I'd say it hasn't gone away pretty much throughout his whole career. He's very good at producing and bringing things in on a good budget. Always will. Okay, so George Lucas's key to his success, the key to his whole success, and if you've ever seen Mad Men, the first season, Don Draper brings this up, I think in the finale, The Wheel. He says that nostalgia is the greatest marketing tool of all time. And he uses an example of his own life. You see, George Lucas, I think in a lot of ways, is a commercial guy, a marketing guy, a guy who thinks about selling things, and I'm not knocking him. I'm just saying I think he thought about those things, so many of those elements to it. He really wanted brand. And I think he knew to do that you needed nostalgia. I think he knew you needed these certain aesthetics and special effects and technical aspects. He said to Ron Howard once, I'm going to make a film like Flash Gordon, but with special effects like 2001. And Ron Howard's like, that's a weird idea, but it totally makes sense when you see it. With American Graffiti, I think George Lucas doesn't feature any of his flaws from his other films, or any things they did a producer. See, my biggest issue with George Lucas is him as an actor's director. I don't think he's a great actor's director, and even Mark Hamill's come out and kind of said this. He's hinted at this in many interviews. I just don't think he's great at dealing with actors. I think he thinks about the technical side of the film and how to execute it for audiences' pleasures, but I don't think he's working with the process of acting very well. It's not his fault. It's just not his strength. The difference with American Graffiti is that it has all of the great aspects of every George Lucas movie. It's got great cinematography. I think this is one of the best looking films of all time. David Fincher was influenced by this film when he was making Fight Club. It's gorgeous. I don't know how it wasn't nominated for Best Cinematography. Beautiful movie. It's got the sound, the dialogue, the characterization, the pace, the fun, the comedy, the sense of adventure, and journeyman almost, the sense of anything can happen, how the story flows. All George Lucas things that we know, and Spielberg. But in this movie, and like Spielberg's The Sugarland Express, which I'm a big fan of, less is so much more here. This is one of George Lucas's, smallest films. He had a very interesting technique in how he shot this film, and I think it was what makes the film work so well. That and the cast. But we'll get to that later. First, let's talk about how he made this film. So this is crazy. And I've read about this a few times as a teenager, but I wanted to make sure today that I was right. So he wanted to give this movie a CinemaScope look, right? But it was expensive, and he decided to give it a documentary-like feel. So he used Technoscope cameras because he believed that Technoscope was an inexpensive way of shooting 35mm film, and utilizing only half of the film's frame would give a perfect widescreen format resembling 16mm. Now that's a little technical, but it's not that complex. He was trying to give a certain look. He couldn't afford it. So what a lot of people do with cameras and Technospace movies, he created the illusion of it with something else. Very simple. But it gave it a documentary look. There's this lived-in, relaxed feeling to American Graffiti. Now, the other half of this movie is the cast. Harrison Ford's in this. Ron Howard. I mean, that's just crazy there. And Harrison Ford's a nobody in this. It's crazy. He's got a cowboy hat on. Beyond that, you have Richard Dreyfuss, one of my favorite actors of all time, is in this movie. It's crazy. Sandy Clark, Cindy Williams, Wolfman Jack. The cast is off the radar. It's insane. But this is George Lucas' first attempt in his career before Star Wars, and I think a template for what he did with Star Wars, to tap into nostalgia. The 70s was a very cynical time. It was very cynical, and the films were cynical. Chinatown's a cynical film. The Godfather's a cynical film. A lot of the movies. Clockwork Orange. There's a lot of negativity. Dog Day Afternoon, George Lucas came in with nostalgia. He took people back to a different time, or at least how they perceived that time. In this world, the 50s and the early 60s. In Star Wars, old movies, the old movie serials, the old space adventures. So the thing is with George is that with nostalgia, he found a way to make audiences feel young again and make them love movies in a way that they hadn't loved it. Because of that, American Graffiti became a huge hit. It made like $50 million on release. They re-released it and it made $60 million. It's one of the most profitable films of all time. It's always, because the budget was so low, all the money they've made off this film's just been profit. George Lucas was able to buy a lot of stuff and keep a lot of stuff in-house because of this movie's success. But the cast is great, and also this movie inspired Happy Days, which Ron Howard was in, or Happy Days, which ran for years. It kicked off this nostalgia boom, which we saw of 50s cultures and stuff that was throughout the 70s and 80s. And we see it now. We are completely engulfed in a culture of nostalgia. And George Lucas is one of the guys who kicked it off, and this movie's seminal in that way. The movies that you love, like maybe Dazed and Confused or Superbad, the Up All Night movies, the teen movies, the coming-of-age films, even John Hughes, they all come from American Graffiti, which you can see the influences throughout cinema all coming together, and the juxtaposition's brilliant because George Lucas is such a good craftsman, and he's a young, hungry filmmaker here. And he's not making a big special effects movie. Also, he does something here that was genius. He lets the actors improvise. I always tell people this. That's the difference between this movie. Because people say to me, what about American Graffiti? Everyone's great in that. Richard Dreyfuss is amazing in that movie. Someone got an Oscar nomination for that. And it's like, yeah, of course. It is a great performances throughout. It's because George didn't write his dialogue like he usually does, and not really direct the actors to say these weird lines, the Kessel Run in 12 parsecs, which Harrison Ford totally pulled off. But in this movie, he wanted a natural feel to go with the cinematography, so he told the actors to just improvise and feel. And a lot of these actors grew up in the time George Lucas saw, but they were alive in the early 60s, so they know what he's trying to do here. They understand. Ron Howard knows what he's getting at. So they all bring so much to it because you didn't know how talented these people. Ron Howard's a very creative, funny, interesting guy. I mean, holy, Harrison Ford just doesn't steals the scenes, you know? There's Richard Dreyfuss ends up being one of the great actors of his generation, you know? It was just these little gem things about it. Francis Ford Coppola producing, George Lucas making it. Those elements coming together are just bonkers. It's just the luck of cinema. George Lucas has said this is his most personal film. He's very attached to it, and I think it shows. I think this is about his life. I think it's his story. I think the jokes are his jokes. I think the moments are his moments, and I think these actors added their moments and their scenes, much like movies that I love, such as Animal House, or plenty of movies that tap into this thing. So when you watch American Graffiti, you're not watching people going off script. You're watching actors who built a bond and figured out a tone and a vibe for this movie with George Lucas, who had a vision. And as a director, the idea is to keep everything as simple as possible. You're trying to get your... David Lynch said this. He said, you have a simple base idea of what your thing is, and you have to try to get it across to everyone, be it the set designer, the actors, the editors, to keep it on that simple idea of what you wanted the movie to be. When you cracked it, when you figured it out. I think everyone was on point and nailed exactly what George Lucas wanted to do here. From the editing, from the way it's shot, it's just insane. And people who really love this movie, like David Fincher, they see that. This is a... It's just a wonderful film. To be under $1 million budget, to be from the early 70s, and be this well executed technically, is something to go back to, but it's not just a technical thing. The movie's emotionally overwhelming in a way other George Lucas films are not. It has a poignancy, because a film like maybe Stand By Me in the same way, at the end you get this you get the resolution. He tells you what happens to all the characters, which was something people didn't really do in a lot of movies at the time. And it told you what happened, and it gave you this feeling like, wow, that's where we were, and here's where we are now. You know? George Lucas used to always look to the future with his films. This movie, in a lot of ways, is looking back to the past. Nostalgically, but painfully. Like Woody Allen's Radio Days, one of my favorite films. This film is such an influential piece of work. It's one of the great pieces of American cinema. I don't know if you haven't seen it, you're crazy. It's under 2 hours. It moves wonderfully. When you're first watching it, you'll immediately fall in love with it at the opening diner scene. But then when you really get into it, you'll realize it's getting deeper, like Dazed and Confused does with this character's other films. It's getting more emotional. It's getting more poignant. It's getting more artistic. And then it just ends absolutely perfectly. And George Lucas doesn't make a false note in this entire film. It's aged great. I think it gets better every time you watch it. I think it's just a timeless film. It's a film made in the 70s to look like a film made before that. And so when you watch it now, there's not a disconnect between it and visuals. And it's wonderful. It is the kickoff of Lucasfilm, and it's a hell of a way to kick it off. And like many great filmmakers that go into great success, they have that early film that really shows who they are. With James Cameron, it's The Terminator or something. This is that movie for George. And this is that movie that when you go back, you're like, man, what could this guy have been had he stayed on this path and maybe didn't become George Lucas Star Wars guy and made all those great movies? What if he had made the Apocalypse Now film he was going to make? He was going to do an adaptation of the book. You know, what if he made some of the other films he had planned to do? It's kind of a crazy idea, this different alternate universe of George Lucas, this insanely talented, great young filmmaker who had vision. And he knew what audiences wanted. He tapped into the zeitgeist in a way no other filmmaker did in the 70s, except Steven Spielberg. But even then, you have to say it was George Lucas that came out ahead, because in overall, we are still living in a post-George Lucas world of Hollywood, and this movie is an early sign of it, and I think still the best version of it. I think this is the best film of nostalgia looking back. I think films like Midnight in Paris give me a same kind of feeling that this does, but this is something that it almost hurts to watch. It's a bittersweet thing. It's a bittersweet dream, memory. It's like photographs. It's something that I can't quite put into words, but I'm trying to articulate it. It's a certain movie that stayed with me, and every time I watch it, I feel like I'm meeting these characters again and going back to that time, and then it hits me the same way every time. So, few movies have done that for me. I thought I was going to fill this list with a lot of these art house foreign films and, you know, animated films and all these films that really were important to me throughout my life, and there will be those, but I thought, man, you know what? Since I'm probably not going to put New Hope on here, and people are going to be like, oh, he doesn't have Star Wars on here, you know, which is fine. And although there might be a Star Wars film on this list, don't worry, and you can probably guess which one it is. This is, to me, I was like, yeah, do I put this in the top 10? I wouldn't quite put it there because other films have really just blown me away thematically to where like I can't even process them. This film I totally get, but as an emotional experience, it's one of my favorites. And honestly, I think on a technical level, it's just as well executed as any other film in the '70s at the time. It's a masterwork of craft, and a lot of the films from this list are going to be in the '70s. American Graffiti, man, it's well, I mean, it's something. It really is. It really is. It's a pulp culture phenomenon. It's something that people forget. This generation seems to be kind of not remembering, but it's an important film to a lot of people, and it led to so many things. And I love it, and I love it every time I watch it. It's a great film to watch at a drive-in. I've watched it with my father, and we talk about it a lot. And it's a film that we talk about ideas in it and things. And I think Kirk or something. I can't remember the character's name. I'll tell you, man. Let me look it up real quick. Sorry, Richard Dreyfuss's character. Yeah, Kurt Henderson. He's one of the most relatable, likable characters ever in a movie for me. I can't. This guy's exactly how I was as a teenager. Like exactly, just a total romantic, dumbstruck in love, confused. It was, which a lot of us were. Wolfman Jack's appearance is just dynamite. The soundtrack is the shit. If you like this time of era of music, you're gonna love this movie. And like I said, there's just nothing really wrong with it in my eyes. It is a masterpiece. I have no problem saying it. American Graffiti from 1973 is a masterpiece. It's one of the best American films ever made. It made George Lucas a star. It proved who he was. He was even known as the American Graffiti guy. Mark Hamill says, "Hey, do you know the American Graffiti guy?" There used to be a time he wasn't known as the Star Wars guy. He was the American Graffiti guy. And there's a reason for that. Because had he not made Star Wars, this film would be his legacy because it was such a big thing. But, man, just damn. What one hell of a movie. Perfect cast. Mackenzie Phillips in this, who's really young in this, is amazing. She feels so real. And you get that natural feel. So George Lucas basically never made a film with more naturalistic acting, so the dialogue feels more fresh and original, organic than any of his other films. It has all the technical craft of his other films, and it's just as groundbreaking and as important as his other films in that sense, because it's doing a lot of the things that led to blockbuster cinema that we saw with Raiders, and we saw with Star Wars and all that stuff. So this film is so important in film history. It's so important in the career of George Lucas and Lucasfilm as a whole. And I wish honestly, I want to go put it in right now, but American Graffiti, 20th favorite film of all time, and I think it's going to stay on that list for a while. I don't think it's going anywhere. Thanks for watching. 19's coming out soon, but I got to figure it out. I'm not sure. The list isn't totally done yet. But what do you think about American Graffiti? Tell me in the comments. Have you seen it? Do you like it? What's your favorite George Lucas movie? And I'll see you guys next time.
Answer the phone, dummy.
Pinky's Pizza.
Yeah, listen, you got any more of those secret agent spy scopes?
It's right on the stethoscope.
No, the secret agent spy scope, man. That pulls into